let's get started. So we have Ms. Natalia Egorova come from MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit in Cambridge, UK. So she did extensive work using fMRI, EEG, MEG in her graduate studies, and today she's going to share with us some of her work, study the neurobiology of language.
Okay, thank you very much for letting me speak. So I'm going to present the data that I collected during my PhD, and we investigated the brain correlates of speech act processing, looking at localization and the time course. We looked particularly at the speech acts of naming and requesting, and also investigated semantic differences so that we could compare semantic and pragmatic levels of psycholinguistic processing in one experiment. So what is a speech act? Most of the time the neurobiology of language concentrated on the meaning of words or sentences, but when we communicate we perform other things. We perform acts with languages. For example, when one says, my car is here, what they are saying is that their vehicle is nearby, but what they might mean by this utterance is actually that they want to give you a ride, so they offer you a lift. Or in another situation, they would probably mean that they're happy that their car hasn't been stolen. So the intention behind the action of uttering can be quite different. So we also know that these communicative functions can be observed in single words as well. So when we hear a word water in the context of what can I get you, then this word means that you're requesting water from the other partner. In the other case, when, for example, you're given a question, what is this? And they say water, then it's naming the liquid in the glass. So even within the single word, you can have these different communicative functions. Normally, speech acts are considered in isolation, but they often occur as sequences of different speech acts, different communicative actions, and they can be visualized like this. Naming can be often followed by correcting or clarification, whereas a request is often followed by giving the object that was asked for, or rejecting this request by saying no, I can't, or denying it, no, I'm not able and not willing to do what you're asking me for. And it can be hypothesized that the naming is mainly supported by the lexical semantic networks, because you need to essentially make a connection between an object and the word. And those are in the left angular gyrus and bilateral temporal cortices. For the request, the main network that could support request processing is the action and mirror neuron system, because you pretty much need to know about the action sequences that follow the speech act in question, and also you need to represent the information about the action, the movement that will follow once you are given the object that you asked for. And those areas are possibly inferior frontal gyrus and posterior superior temporal sulcus, and inferior-parietal areas, premotor cortex. Additionally, in request, what's important is to understand the assumptions that the speakers have about performing the action, and understanding what the intention behind this speech act is. And in this case, probably theory of mind networks could be relevant for this kind of processing. And those comprise, this network comprises medial prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate, temporoparietal junction, among other areas. So what about the when of the speech acts? At the minute, for example, here on the left you have the model of Pickering and Garrett of psycholinguistic levels of processing. So you have here you have phonological, lexical, semantic, and syntactic levels, and only at the top level here there is situational context, situation model. That's what pragmatic level would be approximately. In neuroimaging, and specifically in EEG research, there have been some components identified with specific levels of processing. And again here in Friedrich et al., we see acoustic phonetic processing and syntactic semantic processing having their correlates, However, the white box interpretation is still not filled, but it's supposed to be really high up and quite late. So we are trying to understand at which time and in which areas pragmatic processing takes place. And for the different theories of psycholinguistic information processing, we have cascaded models which presuppose this cascade of effects from low to high, each taking about 100 milliseconds. And that model would suggest that pragmatic processing happens quite late, and there is no interaction between the levels, whereas the near simultaneous model would suggest that there is early interaction between the levels of processing, and we understand the meaning and the function of the word altogether. So we tested those predictions in an EEG experiment, and as I mentioned earlier, we presented our participants with videos of two people communicating. One of them would, for example, ask, what are these called, looking at the objects on the table? And the other person would say, plant, and then point at the plant. This would be our naming condition, and there would be one context sentence and then 10 word action pairs. In the other condition, which would be the requesting condition, this person would ask, what can I get you? And the answer plant, in this case, would indicate that the person wants to get the plant, and then they would get this plant as a result of this interaction. We only concentrate on these two word comparison, and the words are identical. So there is no physical difference between the words that we are measuring at, and EEG is quite precise at the time blocking to 0, or the onset of the word. However, we believe that since there is a different context in which they appear, they would have different neural correlates and differences in time. As I said, we also wanted to investigate where the semantic level of processing happens, and therefore we looked at two categories of words, hand-related and non-hand-related words. In the hand-related class, you can see that they differed in action, handedness, and movement relatedness, whereas they were matched on all the other psycholinguistic variables, such as number of neighbors and bigram, trigram frequency, number of letters, word frequency, all sorts of things, including arousal and balance and potency. So this was what we had as our stimuli. And when we started looking at the EEG, as you remember in Federici 2011, there are no components, EEG components, that actually reflect speech act processing or pragmatic processing in general. Therefore, we looked at it more objectively and took the global field power and collapsed this data across conditions, participants, and channels. And this was the global curve that we got. And we took the top quarter of the peaks that were shown, and those were our times of interest, our time windows for further analysis. In tradition of the EEG research, we also looked at different topographical factors like anteriority and posteriority, left and right hemispheric differences, and compared our two conditions. So in behavior, there was no difference between the conditions, and that's something that we expected because we didn't want them to be different per se. And it's very unlikely that one notices that you used a naming word or a requesting word just in behavior. It shouldn't take longer, or it shouldn't be more difficult in behavior. That was our assumption. However, in the brain correlates of these processes, we expected to find the differences, and in fact we did. So the top row is naming, the bottom row is requesting, and the left column of each of this group of 4 is non-hand-related words, and the right part of the column is hand-related words. And you can see that in the first time window, there is more activation to the request than to naming, and equally here, for example, you can see that the semantic contrast, the difference between left and right is greater than the difference between the top and bottom. So that suggests that there was more activation to the hand-related words. So if we look at the, we did the GFP analysis in a traditional way, the repeated measures ANOVAs with time windows and with all the factors in. However, for presentation here only, I wanted to show you that the contrast between naming and requesting, naming in blue, requesting is in red. So most of the time, across the whole waveform, we have more activation to request than to naming. And specifically in the first time window, it is a significant result of the global field power analysis. And equally, the black line and the grayish line, black is hand-related, gray is non-hand-related. In the semantic context, we see more activation to the hand-related words compared to the non-hand-related words, and that happens in the second time window. So more to this analysis, we also looked at the topographical factors and found an interaction in the first time window of semantic and pragmatic results of variables, and also they interacted with centrality and posteriority, anteriority. Similarly, in the second time window, we also found interaction between pragmatics and semantics, and in the third time window, there was only a main kind of effect, or rather an interaction with anteriority, with laterality, for request. Note that, again, most of the time we have more activation to request compared to naming. However, note also that this was the only time window where we had an activation to naming being greater than to request. That suggests in this time window there is a lot more of this lexical semantic processes going on, and especially since it was the also the time window where we found the semantic results. We also did a reconstruction of sources of these activations, also only for illustration purposes. We didn't do any stats on that. So the top row is request greater than naming, and the bottom one is hand class greater than non-hand class. And here you can see they're quite spotty, but you can see some action activation to request. You can see some right temporoparietal junction activation to request again. And then in naming, again, some action activation because it's hand-related class, and also left angular gyrus and left temporal cortex. So these are somewhat consistent with what we expected, but EEG is not a good method for that. So to sum up, early activation, early interaction between semantics and pragmatics, that's something that supports neurosimultaneous model of processing. Again, semantic processing and naming greater than request pattern in the second time window of about 200 milliseconds, and request greater than naming pattern early about 100 millisecond activation, and then later 260, 335 millisecond activation again. The localization, again, seems like the networks are there, but it's hard to say because it's not a very good method for that. Do you have any questions about this particular study or our stimuli? Because, yeah, that's time. If not, then I'll keep going. So this was the question about the timing mostly, but where in the brain? The neuropsychological studies suggested that the right hemisphere is important for processing pragmatic information, and therefore the prediction here would be that request is more right lateralized than naming. And the other hypothesis was what we predicted was the distributed networks hypothesis, in that we'd have a lexicosemantic network activation for naming and mentalized in a mirror system activation for request. And we tested it in a similar paradigm. However, this time it was auditorily presented words, and we took smaller blocks of 5, and again compared only the word block. We also had a block in which this same kind of faces appeared without pronouncing any words, and that was our kind of baseline condition. So in the whole brain analysis, when we compare words with faces, obviously we get Herschel's gyrus activation and some superior temporal activations, and because it was auditory stimulation versus faces. Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I've lost you completely.
Yeah.
The second experiment. Could you go back
Yeah,
to the paradigm,
of course.
please?
Yeah. So again, we present 2 types of stimuli. The first one is naming. What are these called? And then there is 5 words at a time that name things on the table. And then there are 5 objects pointing. So that was to prevent the overlap of action into the word processing, because in EEG we could have this, well, I won't go back, but in EEG we could separate naming from the action. In fMRI we couldn't, therefore we decided to present 5 blocks of words and then have 5 actions that accompany those words. And again, in the request condition, again, the question was, what can I get you? Or there were several other questions, but this is the typical question that would elicit requesting. And there we had 5 actions of passing over the object. And again, as I said, we compare only word blocks. So this is a less interesting comparison, but just shows that there is more auditory activation. But the real comparison of interest for us was this request greater than naming and naming greater than request comparison. So here you see red is request, blue is naming. So we have some inferior frontal activation to request, some motor activation, bilateral motor activation. This figure shows the uncorrected at p 0.001. However, the stats that I'm presenting here are all FGR corrected only. And the reason I'm showing you this figure and not the corrected one is because there is a slight sign of activation in the left angular gyrus, just like in the previous experiment, which is kind of there, but we don't want to interpret it too much. So as you can see, there is also some visual activation, which we relate to the visual and motor activation. There have been studies that show that when you perform anything action related, you also activate the visual cortex to a great extent. But we also did the regions of interest analysis based on the ROIs that we originally thought would be relevant for speech act processing, based on the previous assumptions. We took ROIs for theory of mind and for action mirror neuron system, and also for some temporal ROIs for language semantics network. And the results here, and this whole column shows the results for the request greater than naming. And we see, again, anterior interparietal sulcus and IFG, and also premotor cortex actually, and posterior STS, all parts of action system and mirror neuron system. Whereas for naming, we mostly found the activations in the temporal cortices, this time bilaterally. You can see that if we look at all of these ROIs and group them by frontal, parietal, or temporal regions, then frontoparietal activations were greater for request, and then temporal activations were greater for naming. And there was no real hemisphere bicondition interaction. So we conclude that the data can be better described in terms of the distributed systems account. So in summary, we do have some evidence that naming elicited activation in lexical semantic network, whereas requests elicited more activation in the action and mirror neuron system. There was not so much of this theory of mind activation, but this has been shown before that mirror neuron system activations are usually automatic, and they reoccur whenever the stimulus is presented, the stimulus that would elicit these activations. Whereas in the theory of mind case, once you presented something and it's already clear what type, for example, of intention it is, the activation goes down, and perhaps this blocked design, this grouping of 5 words in a row, has attenuated the effect in the theory of mind network. Again, we can't check it here. And again, distributed pragmatic networks seems to be the way to go. But what happens if the speech act types are less predictable, and when they're presented not in a block design, but in an event-related design kind? The reason we actually used block design was because we didn't have any priors about where to look and when it will happen and how big the effects are. So we tried to maximize our power, but now that we elicited similar results, we wanted to check what happens in a less blocked context. So this is again to say that fMRI and EEG comparison is not a very good way of determining when things happen in the brain. So we looked at an MEG design, and made it utterly unpredictable and diverse this time. So we not only used naming and request context sentences, but also used a few other types. We not only had only naming or requesting, but also had rejections and clarifications at the level of the speech act. We also had not only actions which were following necessarily after each speech act, but also had different kinds of actions which followed. So that created this different types of trials. And again, as in previous examples, we only looked at this comparison. So although we had controlled for the predictability and the probability of occurrence of each speech check type, we only concentrated on these two again. And again, we used global field power to determine our time windows, and they were slightly earlier, but again, consistent with the MEC components that are typically that are typical for language studies. And here are the results of the whole brain analysis. You can see naming and request in the 5 time windows that we looked at, but more importantly, if you look at the differences, red is request and blue is naming. Again, we see some action activation again. We see some right temporoparietal activations, and in the second time window we also see some left action motor system activation and left angular gyrus. But we mainly concentrated on the regions of interest results, comparing again the same different types of regions of interest that constituted the theory of mind network, the mirror neuron system, and the lexical ROIs. And the results show that they very early, in the very early time window, we see this motor activation and some right temporoparietal activation and also posterior temporal activation, all request greater than naming. In the second time window, the temporoparietal and the posterior temporal activations persist, whereas there is also activation to naming greater than request in the left areas, including the angular gyrus and the left motor activation. And in the final later time window, we see something that's consistent with the theory of mind activation in that we have left TPJ and in concert with medial prefrontal and anterior cingulate activations. So all greater request than naming. So in summary, this single trial design again shows that lexical semantic networks get activated in the second time window between 100 and 200 milliseconds, whereas the action and mirror neuron system activate early, just around 100 milliseconds, and then later at 200, 300 milliseconds. And it seems like in the later time window, the activation is more consistent with the theory of mind, or more frontal activation in the mirror neuron system, like in inferior frontal gyrus, right inferior frontal gyrus. So this is, again, similar results to the previous ones. And finally, we also tried looking at the frequencies, the brain oscillations that accompany those processes, and this is very much work in progress. So we assumed that the language typically is associated with the response in gamma frequency and beta frequency, and this is typical for world knowledge integration, unification, correlates with N400 effect and action word comprehension. So we also looked at action and mirror neuron system typical oscillations, and those are in the beta frequency, usually a decrease and then an increase in the post-movement idling kind of. Also an increase in action inhibition, and also beta has been related to higher level processing of action that is determining whether it's correct or incorrect action. So this could be the frequency that could be relevant for us. And finally, in social processing, there isn't so much done in that domain, other than there is a study about intention processing showing 40, 60 hertz gamma in the frontoparietal areas relevant for intention processing. And somewhat indirect evidence, gamma seems to be impaired in people with autism who also have all sorts of social problems. So it's hard to pin down exactly what frequency would be good for us to use, but in the absence of anything, we use these ones. So we used field trip, and since we knew that the effects of interest happened between 50 and 500 milliseconds, and we already knew that we wanted to look at frequencies below 50 hertz, we filtered our data. We filtered our data and used the Morlet wavelet with 7 cycles, again because 7 cycles give us a good frequency range, the sensitivity and temporal domain. We can also see gamma at about 40 millisecond time windows and beta at about 180. So this is something that we were happy with. We baselined our data and looked at this frequency of interest and used spatial temporal clustering technique available in field trip so that we don't bias our analysis with specific time windows. As before, we usually took very small time windows, but in this case, since it's time frequency domain, we didn't want to use 15 millisecond time windows, and therefore we went for spatial and temporal clustering using 500 randomizations, and we just used the template that's available already in the program. In the beta domain, the results show that between 170 and 500 milliseconds, so pretty much across most of these time window, we have activation greater beta response to requests compared to naming. Again, red will be request greater than naming, blue naming greater than request, or in this case, also the decrease in frequency in response to request. So this time window, parietal beta, as we said, parietal beta is also typical for observation studies, usually. In the higher beta frequency, we have a response between 50 milliseconds and 260 milliseconds. Again, we saw this very early response in our previous data, and this was coming from the frontal central areas. If you can see, the gradiometers usually show the sources which are directly under the sensors. So it probably makes some sense to, although these are magnetometer data, to look at the gradiometer topography as well. And here we see some decrease to request compared to naming. In the gamma domain, we definitely see language-related activation between 100 and 240 milliseconds. I want to remind you that that was, again, the time window where we saw most of our semantic results. And again, the topography of it being left lateralized and being greater for naming and somewhat decreased for request shows that it might be related to the lexical semantic network that we mentioned before. And finally, in the higher gamma frequency, in 280, 340 milliseconds, we saw something that was consistent with our ideas of the theory of mind activation, in that we had this frontal activation, and also, if you look at the topography here, there is something in the right parietal area, possibly. Again, these are gradiometer data. So this could be the network that is relevant for social processing. And again, more activation to request than naming. So the preliminary results here is that using a different method, we again replicate the same kind of networks in the right time windows. And again, this analysis needs to be done still, source space analysis or coherence connectivity analysis, to determine whether we are actually looking at networks rather than just random collection of blobs. So if you have any ideas for this analysis, it would be very gratefully appreciated. And finally, the conclusions. We have looked at speech-act processing, and it seems like in all of the experiments, we have early activation and later processing typical of requests, so about 100 milliseconds and then about 200 or 300 milliseconds, whereas for naming, it's somewhat between 100 and 200 milliseconds. We see an interaction between pragmatics and semantics around already before 200 milliseconds that favors the near simultaneous models, so that all of these levels of processing interact at once. So we have pragmatic and semantic level talking to each other at once. We not only understand the meaning, but also the use of the word. And about the where, it's it seems like the naming elicits activation in the lexical-semantic areas in the temporal lobe or left angular gyrus, whereas the action and mirror neuron system, as well as the ethereal-mind network, could be more relevant for processing requests. And that is evidence of the ensemble of different neural circuits which reflect speech meaning, but they all work together. It's not that they are modular. And I guess this is all I have to say for now. And I'd like to thank my supervisors, Yuri Shtorov and Friedman Pulvamila, and also Gates Cambridge Scholarship, and also, of course, Monica and Samantha and Yorki for inviting me.